All right, so we are going to be starting in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 12. And last week, we noted that the preacher, who I believe is Solomon, gave us kind of a general opening. He looked at some of the things in nature that that just seemed to go on and on and on and never really to accomplish anything. And then he began to look at some personal examples from human experience that did the same thing, and concluded that all was meaningless and purposeless. Now today he's going to actually begin to do a serious search of life to address that question. And he begins with a statement that helps us to understand a little bit more about who he is and when he wrote this. And he starts by saying, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now, this is a very typical statement that you find in a lot of the ancient Near Eastern literature, but it shows us that King Solomon is speaking autobiographically. He's speaking about himself. He's writing about what he's experienced, and he's describing this personal experience for the benefit, the moral benefit of his readers, those that are listening to him, those that are reading his writings. And he notes that he's king over Israel in Jerusalem. And this is important because this description really fits only the life of Solomon, because if you'll recall, when we begin with Rehoboam, his son, and following Rehoboam, all the other descendants of David, they ruled in Jerusalem, but they didn't rule over Israel. They ruled only over the southern kingdom of Judah. At the time of Rehoboam, the kingdom was split into two: the northern 10 tribes, which are then called Israel, and the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, which are referred to as Judah. And so in saying this, the writer is really saying that he is Solomon, unless, of course, somebody is writing later and using the history of Solomon, which I don't believe. And the other thing he says that's, I think, important is he says, I have been king. And he uses the perfect tense of the verb, which tells us that he's writing near the very end of his reign. And last week, Colleen asked, when did Solomon write this? Well, if you believe that Solomon himself wrote it, then we're talking about sometime in the 10th century BC, and probably around 935 BC is as close as we can get to near the end of Solomon's life, when he probably would have written this book. If you don't believe it was Solomon, and some don't, then you're probably dating it after the Babylonian exile, so somewhere in the 5th century BC, quite a bit later. But I don't really see any reason for dating the book that late or assigning it to a writer other than Solomon, when the evidence seems so clear that he's the one doing the writing. At any rate, he goes on and he says, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. So here again, he is now beginning to apply his wisdom and his efforts to what we might say are the ultimate questions. What is the meaning of life? It says he applied his heart, which means, I think, that at the very core of his being, this is the pursuit that he is after. He's focused his mind, he's disciplined his heart to go and to know the truth. Most people go through life and they kind of wonder what the meaning of life is, but they really don't explore all the possibilities the way that the preacher is going to for our benefit. And it's really kind of funny. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie or read the book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I've only seen it once. Some of my friends think it's the greatest movie ever written. It's sort of a cult classic. But I watched it once and I thought it was pretty stupid. But it's really interesting. There's a supercomputer that is been tasked with determining the meaning of life. And it takes this supercomputer 7.5 million years to come up with the answer. And the supercomputer concludes that the meaning of life is 42. And so they asked the computer, why is it that how can you say that the meaning of life is 42? He says, well, I don't know. He says, the computer says, I just put in all the data that was given to me, and the answer is 42. Perhaps you don't know what the question really is. And so I think that's the problem that we face sometimes, is we don't really know what we're looking for. And so we never really find it. But Solomon knew what he was looking for, and he has committed now to this search. And he even says to seek and to search. So this is going to be comprehensive. He wants to know as much as he can about as much as he can, as many things as he can, so that his conclusions will be definitive as possible. He's really making a concerted effort. Sometimes I think we get frustrated, and I was reading an article the other day about something that happened during the Trump administration, where he was accused of something that actually never even happened. But some people had put 2 and 2 together and gotten 6, and had concluded something that actually wasn't true, and all of the news media just went with it. And the essence of the article was not so much that they were deliberately trying to show Trump in a bad light, but the fact that they didn't bother to even investigate to see what the truth was. And when the truth came out, it wasn't anything like what was reported by any of the news media. That's not going to be true of the preacher. The preacher here is definitely seeking out all the information he can get, so that what he concludes is valid. And he says he's doing it by wisdom. Now, the Hebrew word for wisdom is a very broad term. And I think here we need to conclude by the fact that Solomon never mentions God. He never mentions divine revelation. And so the wisdom that he's talking about is a worldly wisdom. It's what human beings can learn about the world without any special revelation from God. Solomon certainly had wisdom and the knowledge of God to use, but you remember that's not how he's approaching this subject. He's approaching it as one who does not know God, and he's trying to show us what the world is and what the world has to offer apart from a relationship with God. And so here he's using human wisdom, and he says that he's looking at all that's done under heaven. Now, we already looked at really what is a synonymous phrase, and that's under the sun. And we concluded that that's just all the things that we do, all of human endeavor, all of human life, looked at from the perspective of the observer, without any reference to the supernatural at all. So this phrase done under heaven is the same. It's just a change of words to make it a little more interesting. But what is done under heaven is also what is done under the sun. And it's the same area of life apart from God. Now, he doesn't tell us all that he did here. In the very next section, where he's going to be talking about pleasure, he's going to tell us all the different kinds of pleasure that he looked at. Here, he just says he started a search using wisdom. And we know that he was a very wise man, so we can assume that he did any number of things to draw his conclusion, but he just gives us his conclusion. And that is, it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Now, again, we need to understand that word unhappy, because the word unhappy really refers to something that's bad or evil. The problem is not that life just makes us unhappy. The problem is that life is evil in itself. And that can be taken a couple different ways. One is that he could be just talking about the things that people do. Human activity in general is evil, and that makes sense because we live in a sinful world and we are sinful people, and even the best of us do evil things or sinful things. But the preacher may also be indicating that in his attempt to understand what life was all about, that as he looked for answers, the harder that he tried to understand it, the more burdened he became about life, and he never arrived at any meaningful conclusion. So however we look at it, we realize that it is an unhappy business that God has given to us. And then he goes on to say, I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. So again, he says, I've looked at everything that people do from an earthly perspective, and again, it comes up meaningless, it comes up empty, it comes up futile. And he even uses that word behold as emphatic. Behold, it's this way. Look, pay attention, because this is what I have concluded. And then he uses another phrase, I think, to help us to better, if there is a better way to say it than vanity or futility or meaningless. He says it's a striving after the wind. And that word can mean chasing, it can mean feeding or shepherding. Probably here, I think the best translation would be chasing. But you can almost picture that, can't you? Shepherding the wind or chasing the wind. It's a futile effort. You can't catch the wind. You can't direct the wind. You can't cause it to go where you want it to go. It goes where it wants to go. And so again, what he is saying to us is that trying to figure out the meaning of life purely from personal experience is unattainable. It's as unattainable as striving after the wind. So with that, he concludes this section with a proverb. Now you can recognize these proverbs in Ecclesiastes in that they're set off in, I think, all of the modern translations. They're set off as poetry, which is what they are. Proverbs are poetry, but usually they're focused on two lines that are in parallel to each other, and they're either synonymous, that is, they say the same thing in different ways, or they can be antithetical. One line says one thing and one line says something else, which is typical of Hebrew poetry. But they're also, you can see the difference between a proverb and poetry in that the proverb is, it gives a statement that's somewhat enigmatic. You have to think about what is being said in order to arrive at the truth that's there. And I think that's what he's doing here. If we look at it, he says, what is crooked cannot be made straight. So what he's saying is some things in life are crooked in the sense that they're so bent out of shape that no matter what effort we make, it's not going to make them straight again. And we can think of all kinds of things that we've probably experienced in life. I listed some things like, arguments at home, conflicts at church, wrongs that are done in our workplace, mistakes the government makes, often mistakes the government makes that affect us, our moral failures and physical disabilities that people have. But one thing that kind of drove it home to me, and I was not really looking for this, but I was looking for something else on the internet, and the dogs are probably barking at someone delivering something. Looking at something on the internet, and I saw this article about this Texas father that was grieving over a decision that he made. And so I read the article, and it turns out that his 14-year-old daughter had been brutally raped by a man, and she'd been left in such emotional turmoil that probably she's never going to fully recover in this lifetime. And yet she went through the process of exposing herself publicly in the hopes that she could, that there would be some justice brought to this man who they did figure out who he was. And so he was brought to trial, and he was convicted of the rape. And the prosecuting attorney asked for 15 years. And surprisingly, the judge who made the final decision gave him 180 days. And I thought, how can that be right in any world? How could a man who calls himself a judge be that callous to what has happened to give that light a sentence? And that's what the preacher is saying. He's saying that there are things in life that are so messed up that there's nothing we can do to make them right. And then the second part of that proverb is, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Now here again, he might mean that what we don't have, we can't count. We can't we can't do anything about. But he could also be saying that we don't seem to know what we're missing. What we don't have, we don't know that we don't have it, or that even if we know it's missing, we can't measure it. We can't know what it is and to what extent it is missing. So if we take those two together, basically, we could summarize it like this: life is what it is, and there's not much we can do about changing it. And that's his conclusion. It's messed up, it's crooked, and there's very little that we can do to straighten it out. Now, with that, that's the end of his first attempt, but he's not done, not by a long shot. And so he now has a conversation with his heart. I take pleasure in knowing that he talks to himself, because I do all the time, and I know I'm considered strange for doing it. And but he has a heart-to-heart, I think is what we would say. He had a heart-to-heart talk with his soul. And he says, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. He was the wisest man who ever lived. The Bible makes that clear, and the history that we have makes that clear as well. And so what he's saying here is, I've taken this quest as far as I can take it, which makes him the ultimate test. If he's the wisest man that ever lived, and he took the quest as far as he could take it, and if he couldn't figure it out, then no one could. And I think this is significant here, because a lot of people say, well, okay, but I'm sure he's missed something. Well, it's not likely, considering who he was and how he went about it. Most people would never take this kind of time, this kind of effort, and most people aren't anywhere near as wise as Solomon was. So if Solomon says this isn't the answer, we can pretty much take that to the bank, that that's not the answer to the meaning of life. And then he uses this phrase, all who were over Jerusalem before me. Now, we're tempted to think that there wasn't any in Jerusalem before him except for King David, but that's really not true. The Bible says that the Jebusites occupied Jerusalem for centuries before David conquered the city and made it his capital. And the most famous ruler of Jerusalem, of course, is Melchizedek, who was king in Jerusalem back at the time of Abraham, and certainly surpassed them all in his ability both to understand and to rule, and is seen as a unique priesthood to which Jesus Christ is referred. So now Solomon says, I'm going to take a different approach. And so he says, I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. Now here he's using the words madness and folly the way that they're usually used in the Old Testament. And that is to refer to mad foolishness of living in disobedience to God. He's taking, I guess what we could say, a comparative approach. He's comparing the good, the right, and the wrong. And he's trying to look at the difference between the two. And in 1 Kings 11, we learn that Solomon married many wives and worshiped many idols. It's one of the saddest chapters in the Old Testament, causing many people to say that Solomon learned more about folly than anyone ever should. In fact, several commentaries said he seems to have taken this to extremes. He should have stopped long before he did. But again, he was trying to look at, is the meaning of life in doing the right thing as opposed to doing the wrong thing? It's interesting to me that I can remember a statement by Pascal, who had said that if we live a life the way Christ has encouraged us to live, even if there is no God, we've lived a better life than those who don't live that way. And I've often thought that was pretty wise counsel, until you begin to realize that Pascal is assuming that there is a God, even though he's saying if there isn't one, because that makes sense only if there is a God who has given a standard which is a better standard than doing the wrong thing. If it's really true that we are just the product of chance, that evolution is the way we arrived, and there really is no ultimate purpose in life, then living a life that's good makes no sense at all. And that's really what Solomon has concluded, is that if we're really just a product of chance, then the thing to do would be just what the evolutionists say. It's the survival of the fittest. That's the best way to live, is take care of yourself. Don't worry about other people. In order to survive, you can't treat them as your friends. And so Solomon says, when I look at this from this perspective, comparing wisdom and madness and folly, obedience and disobedience, I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind. Conventional morality apart from God does not satisfy the soul. It just doesn't. And it's interesting that man has tried for many, many years to just live a quote unquote moral life without a relationship with God, and it doesn't work. And then he makes a very profound statement. I think it is profound because when you think about it for a while, you realize how true it really is. And coming from the wisest man in the world, I'm sure that it was even more. It even affected him more than it would affect us. And he says, "For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." Again, this is a proverb. It should be shown as a proverb in your text. Again, it's set apart in proverbial form so that you recognize it that way. And the word vexation that he uses is an irritation. It's a frustration of the soul that actually verges on creating anger within the person. And Leupold, I thought, in his commentary, put what in the best way what was actually being said. He says, gaining wisdom leads a man to find out many disturbing things that may militate strongly against his peace of mind. A lot of times, gaining wisdom would cause us to learn many things that we would rather not know about. The more we know, the more trouble it brings. It's really interesting, as I thought about it, many people that I've talked to in recent days have told me that they've stopped watching the news because it just makes them mad, makes them angry. Some of the time, I think it makes them angry because of the way the stories are reported, but many of the times it makes them angry because of what's being reported. It just shows how evil things are. And they're finding that just not listening to that helps them actually appreciate life and enjoy life more than knowing all these things. And I think really this is what the preacher is saying, is he had this great knowledge and great wisdom, and the more that he studied these things, the more that it irritated him, the more it led to a vexation of his soul when he saw all the wrong that was done. And so not only does wisdom not bring the meaning of life, but it actually shows how senseless and futile and vain life really is. And that was his conclusion then. So if we can make some conclusions about this section of his search, and again, Solomon doesn't give us these conclusions, but I want you to understand that this is part of the purpose of his writing, is to drive us to these conclusions. You have to find these conclusions elsewhere. Solomon doesn't give them to you. He could have in many respects, certainly not the way the New Testament does, but much of this is in the Old Testament. But he doesn't do that for the purpose of causing you to stop and to think, but it's to drive you in that direction. And the first comes from Jeremiah 9. So it's an Old Testament passage where God says, human wisdom's only going to take us so far. And so he says, I tell you not to boast in our own wisdom, but only in our knowledge of him. If we boast in our own wisdom, we're being foolish, because wisdom human wisdom is not that helpful. Now, if we go to the New Testament, then we find that God says that he will destroy the wisdom of men, destroy the wisdom of the wise. And how is God going to do that? he's going to do it by accomplishing his purpose through the foolishness of the cross, which is foolishness to the wise, but is wisdom to those who are being saved by it through the Lord Jesus Christ. And again, we find that same idea in Isaiah 29, verse 14. So Ecclesiastes is one of the sources that we have that demonstrates God's destroying the pretensions of human wisdom by showing us how empty all of that is without him. And it drives us then to seek the one who can actually make life meaningful for us. And then finally, we know that Jesus Christ is called the wisdom of God. So true wisdom comes through a relationship with Jesus Christ. So if we can keep these things in mind, we can balance what the preacher says. But I think he would want us to do it this way because he's standing again in the position of he's preaching to believers, but he's standing in the position of unbelievers and saying, look, if you choose to live life as an unbeliever, this is what lies ahead for you. And I think it's wise that we see how he does this because we're bombarded with this every day. You turn on the television and this is all you get. If you watch it for an hour, you get 1 hour of this, which tells you that everything that you need is right here in the world. And this can be your forever home and you can have all of this stuff. And Solomon is saying it's not going to satisfy you. It won't satisfy your soul because God has placed eternity in your heart and a longing for a relationship with him. So let me stop for just a moment and see if there's any questions or comments about this portion of his search, which has to do with wisdom and wisdom compared with folly. Okay, we will continue our search then in chapter 2. And as you can see from the very first verse, it's about pleasure. I said to my heart, or I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. So the preacher has now decided to take another approach, doing something new to see if he can get more out of life than he got with just wisdom alone. And the word test is important here because it indicates that what follows is an experiment. He's not just seeking pleasurable things for the sake of pleasurable things. He's actually testing them, deliberately trying to learn something from personal experience that might lead him to conclude what the meaning of life is. Also, the word pleasure shows us where he's going in this section. The pleasures of life are the things that he's after. He's trying to see if those things can make a difference in the way one lives. And I hope you note in this section as we read through it, the number of times he says I. Now, granted, he is writing an autobiography, but even in an autobiography, this is a lot of I's, even for that. And it does seem to speak to the fact that he is being very self-indulgent on this search, that he is very self-centered. In fact, that's really the subtitle of my chapter 2 in the English Standard Version. It says, the vanity of self-indulgence. That's where he's headed. And so one commentator used the word experimental hedonist, that the preacher had decided to become an experimental hedonist. Now, hedonism is just the pursuit of pleasure, and a hedonist is one who is made pleasure the central aim of his life. And so I think this is a good description of what the preacher is doing here, because he's chosen to make his own happiness his chief end of life. Now, those of you who know the Westminster Shorter Catechism, question number 1, you know that the answer to that question is man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. But here the preacher has decided that the chief end of life is to make himself happy. But it's an experiment because he's trying to see if this is really the answer. And so you're going to see how he does it. And he does it in a very interesting way, a very unique way, I think. And yet he does look at a number of things that we would today even consider very pleasurable. Now, he gives us the conclusion up front. This is a little different. The previous time he gave us what he looked at, and then he gave us the conclusion. Here he says, but behold, this also was vanity. So even after he's looked at all the pleasures of life, he finds them also empty, elusive, meaningless. Now he's going to actually go through them, and he's going to show us what he looked at. But the conclusion is already out there. So we know ahead of time. It's like reading the last page of a book. Before you've read the whole rest of the book, you know how it ends. Well, this search ends in vanity, just like the last one did. But he's going to tell you what he's looked at. And the first thing was laughter. Now, again, laughter is something that we use all the time. It's good to laugh. I think it's personally good sometimes to laugh at ourselves and laugh at the situations that we're in, because sometimes it brings out the truth of life in a way that helps us to see what's wrong and then to do something about it. And one of the things that's been interesting to me to see is that Paul and I have been going back. We can't find anything to watch on TV, so we've been going back and watching shows that were put out 20, 30 years ago. And the one thing that's really interesting is the shows back then made fun of the things that were wrong in society in such a way that you could really see that they were wrong, but you could also laugh at them. And today, if you are to try to laugh at something like that, you're considered a racist or a bigot or something else. We can't laugh at ourselves today at all. And so what we do in our laughter is we make it a perverse kind of laughter. And you're going to see that that's the conclusion that the preacher comes to. He says, I said of laughter, it's mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? Now here, mad does not, again, refer to being out of one's mind, but again, something sinful. Derek Kidner described it as moral perversity rather than mental oddity. Laughter can be morally perverse. Joking can be frivolous, it can be superficial, pointless, but it can also be very cynical, very sarcastic, even cruel. And if you look at some of those proverbs that I listed there, you can see how Solomon deals with that in the book of Proverbs. But I think we've all seen laughter, humor, comedy really turn ugly and make a point in such a way that people are really seriously hurt by the comments that were intended to be quote unquote funny. At any rate, the preacher says laughter is a useless pleasure. It does not help one in finding lasting meaning or purpose in life. It can be an escape from life, but it can't be anything more than that. So what's next? It's wine, it's drink. And he says, I search with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. So he's trying, we'll say alcohol. Now we know that back then, what they considered wine and the alcoholic content of wine is very different than what we do today. But nonetheless, you can still get drunk on it. But that's not what the preacher is doing. And I think that is determined by the very next phrase that he uses, my heart still guiding me with wisdom. It looks almost contradictory initially because if you're going to cheer your body with wine, you're certainly not going to be guided with wisdom. Most people don't drink wine to be guided that way. So probably the best way to understand the meaning is that this is a controlled experiment. He's not going to give himself over to drunkenness. Rather, he's going to drink sensibly, in moderation. He's going to remain sober, and he's going to think about the situation. He's going to assess it again, this is still a test, and he's going to use his wisdom to determine if, in fact, this is helping in terms of finding meaning and purpose in life. Again, this is a very popular thing for people to use today, though most of the time I think they don't find so much meaning in it as they do escape by using alcohol. And yet, if you look at the commercials on television, and I've been doing that as I've been doing the study, because I want to see how the commercials that are bombarding our society actually relate to what the preacher is saying. And if you look at the commercials on drinking, they all try to emphasize the fact that, look what a wonderful time you can have by drinking with your friends. That's the whole purpose. It's not really a focus on the beverage. It's a focus on the good times that are happening while the beverage is being consumed. And again, that's what Solomon is dealing with. Is that really true? Is that a way really to find happiness in life? What does he say? He says, so my heart is still guiding me with wisdom and how to lay hold on folly. That is, how to grab a hold of this revelry, that I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven. You know, to look at revelry and see if there's anything good about it. That's what I'm trying to do. And then he uses a phrase that I think is very important in this search for him. He says, during the few days of their life. He recognizes, as we all should, if we're sensible human beings, that life is brief. And this is one of the main reasons people pursue pleasure, because life is so short. I shared with you last week that commercial that I've always remembered, and it was years and years and years ago, but it was a beer commercial, and it said, you only go around once in life, so grab all the gusto you can. Again, the idea of going around once in life is short, life is brief. The other phrase that people would use is life is short, so eat, drink, and be merry. You don't have a lot of time, so make the most of your time here by enjoying yourself. How do you do that? Alcohol is one of the ways you can do it. Again, we know what the outcome was. He's already told us, but he's tried that, and clearly it didn't work. So what's the next thing he tried? This is interesting. He says, I made great works. I built houses. I planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. So he's an architect. He's a builder, developer. I put, he's probably made better homes than gardens. I mean, that's what if you ever look at that magazine, that's what you see. You see all the beautiful homes and all the beautiful landscaping that goes around it. And I can't imagine that you've ever seen a home that looked quite like this, though. If you've ever been up to Canada and seen Bouchard Gardens, that used to be a personal residence. And the wife of the man who originally lived there, it was a kind of a concrete magnate, but she decided to use his quarries and to build these beautiful gardens, and he allowed many of his employees to help her do it. So it was one time a personal residence, but even that I don't think compares to what Solomon undertook. And if we look at 1 Kings, and we're not going to read all of this, but I would challenge you to go back and see what it is that he's referring to here. In 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 through 12, it says that King Solomon spent more than a decade building his royal palace, and at great expense. In fact, if you read that passage, I've read it a number of times trying to figure out what the house actually looked like, because it's a little confusing, but there's layer upon layer and these vaulted ceilings and all this beautiful wood, and the dimensions of the house, even in cubits, makes it huge. But to tell you the truth, when Bill Gates built his house on Lake Washington, I think it was bigger than King Solomon's house. Bill Gates' house at the time that he built it was 50,000 square feet. So I don't think Solomon's was quite that big. So you can see the comparison is how we live today, even in comparison to how Solomon lived back then. But his house was beautiful, and then he was skilled in viticulture. He planted many vineyards. We see that in the Song of Solomon, which was probably necessary to supply wine for his great banqueting hall, which was immense, and all of the entertaining that he did. He was involved in horticulture, planting flowers, fruit trees. He has this huge reservoirs that have enough water to water a small forest. Derek Kidner, again, I thought was right on. He says, he creates a little world within a world, multiform, harmonious, exquisite, a secular Garden of Eden, full of civilized and agreeably uncivilized delights, with no forbidden fruits. And the other thing I want you to notice here is the word myself. He uses it 3 times in these verses. Now, the Bible describes these projects as great works. That's the first. I made great works, but they're not public works. They're not a public park. They're not for the benefit of the people. This is his personal residence. This he created for himself. So again, it's very self-centered in terms of all that he's done. But again, having all this wealth and all this time, and he could direct all this energy, and probably having, as we're going to see in a minute, all these slaves, he was able to accomplish these wonderful works. And again, part of his reason for doing so was to see if maybe building things like this might bring true happiness. So he goes on, I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. And again, given the scope of these building projects and the size of the property, he would have had to have had a huge workforce just to run the daily operations. So he asks the question, where did he get these slaves? He says he purchased them, but one passage I did want to read to you, this was interesting, 1 Kings chapter 9. There's a couple passages in there that I want to read to you, but the first one here has to do with these slaves. And it's interesting where he gets a large number of them. It says, all the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. You remember, those were the people that were in the land before Israel entered the land back under the time of Joshua. They were the ones who were supposed to be entirely eliminated because their time had come. Their iniquity was full, and God had told the Israelites to completely destroy them. But it says, who were not of the people of Israel, their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction. That's what was supposed to happen. They were supposed to be destroyed. And it says that Israel was unable to do that. Well, they were unable to do it, Joshua says, because one, they didn't trust God and didn't trust God to help them to do it. Or second, they didn't bother to obey God and just let them live in the land. So these people have been living now since the time of Joshua in the land with them. These Solomon drafted to be slaves, and so they are to this day. That is the day of this writing. But of the people of Israel, Solomon made no slaves. So he's not taking Israelites, he's taking these foreign people whom God had said to destroy, and Israel refused to do it, and he's making them his slaves. But he's got this whole household full of them, and then of course they give birth to children, and those children are slaves as well. Secondly, and I just lost my place, so I want to keep it. He says, I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. So again, to feed everyone, the preacher had to keep flocks of cattle and herds and sheep and goats. Now here is every day the chefs in his royal kitchen would prepare. This is a quote from 1 Kings 4:23. 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer and gazelles and roebucks and fattened fowl. I don't know how many chefs he had, but that's a lot of animals to prepare on a daily basis. Again, he says, I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. So some of the treasures that he had did come from taxes, but the large majority of it came from other kingdoms. Either was taken by Solomon or given to him as part of peace treaties. Solomon was so powerful that many of them wanted to make peace with Solomon. And we're going to see not only did they give him wealth, but they also gave him wives. And that's where he got a lot of his wives. They were part of these treaties that were made. And of course, that led to his idolatry, as well as if you read the king's passages that relate to that. So in 1 Kings 9, 26 through 28, it says, I'm in 2 Kings, I'm sorry. King Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent with the fleet his servants, seamen who were familiar with the sea, together with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and brought back their gold, 420 talents, and they brought it to King Solomon. So you can see just one example of where a lot of this wealth came from. And then he says, I gathered singers, both men and women. So back then, music was a very rare pleasure for anyone to have. But Solomon had so much money, so much wealth, that he could bring into his house entire choirs to sing for his pleasure. And then finally, and many concubines, the delight of the children of man. So 1 Kings 11:3 tells us the number. He had 700 wives and princesses and 300 concubines. So 1,000 women in his harem. 1,000 women were a part of his life. And so again, sexual pleasure certainly was anything he really wanted it to be. And so he concludes, so I became great and I surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. There's no question he had more of everything than anyone else ever had. And it's, I don't think, an exaggerated statement to say that the world's wealth flowed into Jerusalem for Solomon's disposition. It just, he had so much because of his wisdom, because of his power, because of his standing. The wealth of the world came to Solomon. And but he says, and I think, again, important for us to realize that, also my wisdom remained with me. Again, no matter what he's done here, and we've seen what he's done. He's looked at laughter. He's looked at alcohol. He's looked at great works. He's indicated that he has all these possessions, slaves and cattle and herds and flocks and gold and silver and singers, and then wives and concubines, all of this stuff he's had, and he's been experimenting with all of it. But again, with the idea that even while he's testing his heart, he's still looking to see whether pleasure would really show him the meaning of life. And again, Derek Kidner says, part of him stands back from it all to see what frivolity does to a man. So he's not all in. He's testing it, and he's testing it to the full extent of his ability, but at the same time, he's evaluating it. He's not just doing it, but he's evaluating it to see if it really does bring meaning to life. And I think that's significant. We need to realize that that's really what he's aiming at here. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. So he denies himself nothing visibly entertaining, nothing inwardly satisfying. He experiences joy in doing the work, but he views it as he deserves it as a reward for his hard work. Um, and one of the things that I thought was interesting, this comes from Philip Ryken's book, and it's a little bit of a long quote, but I thought it was interesting the way that he approached it. After he finished with after we looked at this entire episode in the life of King Solomon and all that he had and all that he did, Ryken says this: wine, women, and song. The Solomon of Ecclesiastes had it all. Today, his face would be on the cover of Fortune magazine, in the annual issue of the wealthiest men in the world. His home would be featured in a photo spread with Architectural Digest, the interior and the exterior, from the wine cellar to the lavish gardens. Pop stars would sing at his birthday party. Supermodels would dangle from his arms. I think he's right on. That's exactly what would happen if he was alive today. In fact, exactly what happens to people who have that kind of money today. He says, don't you find it hard not to envy the man? Wouldn't you like to live like a king? All other things being equal, wouldn't you rather have a bigger, nicer house with better, more beautiful views? Don't you wish that you had someone to do all your work for you, or at least all the work that you don't enjoy doing? Think of all the money that Solomon had, with all of the choirs and concubines. Honestly, if you could get away with it, wouldn't you be tempted to grab some of his gusto for yourselves? Now, I don't want to leave it there, because he sets you up. And then he says, like Solomon, we have ample opportunity to indulge our sinful and selfish desires. In fact, maybe Solomon would envy us. Generally speaking, we live in better homes than he did, with better furniture and climate control. We dine at a larger buffet when we go to the grocery store. We can buy almost anything we want from anywhere in the world. We listen to a much wider variety of music. And as far as sex is concerned, the internet offers an endless supply of virtual partners, providing a vast harem for the imagination. By every indication, then, we are living in the godless times that Paul described for Timothy, when people would be lovers of pleasure than lovers of God. Everything is offered to us. Nothing is unavailable. And I think that's a way of bringing it home, and the danger that lies in living in a society like ours. The temptations are there, and Solomon wants us to see that the answers do not lie in the pursuit of pleasure. And so he finishes with this: then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. The verb considered there literally means to face. That is, to look at someone or something right in the eye. So Solomon's basically saying he's facing up to the situation. He's looking at life as it really is, and this is his conclusion as he does that. Pleasure pursued for its own sake does not and cannot satisfy the soul or bring meaning to life. It was interesting at this point. I had this in my notes from a previous time, both of these in a previous time when I did Ecclesiastes, because when I read Ecclesiastes, I can't help remembering the song of Peggy Lee. I hated this song when I was a child. Is That All There Is? It's a song where she talks about, as a child, she went to the circus and her dad took her to the circus, and she saw all these beautiful clowns and acrobats, and everything was so beautiful. And then at the very end, she said, is that all there is to a circus? And I thought, oh, come on. How can you be that? How can you view a circus or anything else in that way to come away from an experience like that? Is that all there is? And I still don't like the song, but I now realize that that's exactly what the preacher is saying to us. He's looked at all of life and he says, is that all there is? Is that all there is to life? And then I had found this comment from Tom Brady. I think you all know Tom Brady. for years, the quarterback of the New England Patriots, and then 1 year, this last year, with another team. This is what he said about Super Bowl after he'd won his 3rd Super Bowl ring. Quote, "Why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think that there's something greater out there for me? I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, hey man, this is what is. I reached my goal, my dream, my life. Me, I think it's got to be more than this. This isn't. This can't be what it's all cracked up to be. I wish I knew. I wish I knew." So my question is, now that he has, to my count, 7 Super Bowl rings, is he still looking? Is he any more happy with life than he was when he had 3? So what are our conclusions then? Again, what the preacher is trying to get us to see is that our dissatisfaction with life should point us back to God. If all the pleasures under the sun can't satisfy our souls, then we need to look beyond those pleasures to the God in heaven, because satisfaction really only comes from God himself. And this is one of the main reasons why I think the book of Ecclesiastes is so valuable, because even if we know that, we're always tempted by the things around us to indulge in its pleasures, and to put more stock in those pleasures than we ought to, and to treat them in ways that God doesn't want us to treat them. And so Ecclesiastes drives us away from that to say, no, the answer is not there. You will not be happy if you go in that direction. But, and here's the important thing, when we put our faith in Jesus Christ alone, the very pleasures that once failed to satisfy now help us to find a greater joy in the goodness of God. If we realize that they come from God as a blessing through Jesus Christ, our whole attitude toward these pleasures will change. And so what I said was meaningful hedonism, that is, pleasure with a purpose. We need to see that God has given us these things for our benefit. And if we use all of the things that Solomon talked about for the kingdom of God and for the benefit of other believers, we will find happiness and joy in those things. But if we try to use them apart from God for our own benefit, they're not going to bring any happiness at all. And so you can look up those verses on your own, but the Psalm talks about wine. Nehemiah, the building, it was really neat that this is a passage that talked about the rejoicing over the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. They accomplished that by God's grace in 50 days. I can't even imagine how you could build the walls of Jerusalem in 50 days, but God allowed them to accomplish it. And they had this worship service and praising God for their ability to build. Again, building by God's grace is a beautiful thing. Building for your own glory, which is what Solomon did, is not helpful. Work. If we work unto the glory of God, then work can be meaningful, and we're going to see that Solomon supports that later on. And then food. You remember 1 Timothy says all things. If we see it, all things come from God and are given to us as a blessing, and we give God thanks for them, then we can enjoy them all. We don't have to say, oh, we can't eat this, we can't eat that, we can't enjoy this. And then, of course, what Jesus says is if you store up your treasures in heaven, meaning that you use your gifts and abilities for eternal things, those things can never be taken from you. That kind of hedonism is a real blessing. We're using the wealth that we have to enlarge the kingdom of God. So these are things, again, that Solomon doesn't say, but this is where he's driving us with the things that he is talking about.